Welcome to another episode of the Federal Newswire Lunch Hour Podcast with your host, Andrew Langer.
Well, hey there, everybody. Welcome to yet another installment of our special series from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour on the REINS Act, the REINS Act in Focus. I'm Andrew Langer. Joining us today is Patrick McLaughlin. He is a research fellow at the Hoover Institution. So glad he can join us. He's done a lot of work on the REINS Act over the years. And I mean, Patrick, was talking with Jonathan Adler earlier. He was talking about 50 years of this being discussed. We certainly know that it was first talked about at the federal level about, 14 years ago. Either way, why is it important and why is it important now?
I think regulation overall should be more important in the eyes of every American. It's somewhat hidden. I mean, maybe not to people inside the Beltway, but to the average person, just because the effects of it are more subtle than a tax. But it is a tax. Regulations effectively are federal or state or local taxes that we should be more concerned about. And the REINS Act specifically is a way to have another layer of concern, of control of these taxes. So, I know you've talked to a lot of people about this, but setting the stage very basically on the REINS Act, it's having a layer of congressional oversight. And it's really about separation of powers. The regulations come out of the executive. There's all these hundreds of agencies at the federal level that create their own rules. The volume of regulations created by regulators compared to the volume of laws that are passed every year, it's something like 27 to 1.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of lawmaking going on, but it's not lawmaking from Congress. So what we need is another layer of protection to make sure those regulations, these laws that are being made by bureaucrats are matching up with what constituents want, what voters want. And the only way voters are able to speak is, of course, by voting, and that's reflected in the makeup of Congress.
It's the issue of accountability, and this is, never fret that, yes, we've talked to a number of different people, but, everybody has a slightly different perspective, and all of these perspectives come together to give us a very clear picture as to what this is all about. I mean, it's like we've been talking about the issue of size and scope of federal power. And if the federal budget is one expression of the size and scope of that power, and that comes from revenue and the amount of, taxes that are levied against the people, the non-taxed economic impact, which is, you're right, is a hidden tax, is yet another measurement of this. So when you're going to add $100 million in economic burden, that's an expression or a measurement of the force and effect of regulation. So this gets to your point of it being a tax, and it gets to the issue of accountability. Talk about the accountability aspect of this, and especially with the idea that if you're skeptical of government power, you should be looking at this as a possible solution.
Yeah, I feel like
a lot there. I know.
Well, the accountability aspect is important. I feel like it should make this a bipartisan sort of approach here.
Right.
Because what we're talking about is, again, it's Congress being able to say this agency or the president is going in a direction that we don't like. And so it's a separation of powers issue here. If we're talking about a Republican administration, then Congress could oppose that. But of course, it could go the opposite way too. And this could, another point to be made here is the regulations. We call them regulations, but really we're talking about the term of art here is rulemakings.
Right.
So this is when an agency wants to modify the code of regulations that's on the books. That could be to add new rules, but it could be to take away rules.
Sure.
And both of those would have a layer of accountability added in here. Congress could approve of those sorts of actions, whether they're regulatory or deregulatory, if a REINS Act were in place. So I think it's fairly simple. I don't think it's hard to understand here that Congress should have a say here. Constitutionally, we hope that Congress is responsible for making laws, but they've really abdicated that responsibility over the years by creating all these agencies that just run on autopilot. This is hopefully taking the autopilot away to some degree.
And I want to come back to that, but I want to ping exactly on something you said about the nonpartisan nature of all of this, because the work you're doing at Hoover, the work you've done in the past, has been nonpartisan. Because someone brought up the issue of this movement, the so-called "No More Kings" movement, right? And obviously, folks who are deeply, deeply concerned about the amount of power this particular administration has, this particular executive branch. There should be a case to be made for a lot of the folks attending these events that if you are concerned about this and if you're concerned about the activity, the unilateral power that the executive branch has, maybe you should be examining and, in fact, supporting something like the REINS Act. Your thoughts here in that regard?
I'm very much in agreement there.
Yeah.
I recently was speaking to some members of Congress, and this is a congressional testimony. And this was right after Doge got created and Elon Musk was in the headlines a lot. And members on the left were complaining about process here, saying, Elon Musk wasn't elected and he's going around and doing all these things that they didn't like. And I was just thinking the whole time, there were all these opportunities over the
Right.
last 10, 15 years to change the process so that you could have more of a say here and so that it wouldn't be strictly executive in nature. So yeah, if you're worried about any abuse of power and you're in Congress, you should want something like reins.
Well, this is why it gets back to my befuddlement. Or maybe it was fake befuddlement, and I should have expected this. But in light of the Loper Bright, relentless decision last year, you had a number of members of Congress who were aghast. How dare the Supreme Court say that the Congress needs to have a greater say in these things, and agencies should have less deference in terms of how they interpret statute. And so there was a move, a proposal, an introduction of a Stop Corporate Capture Act to do just that, to push that interpretive power back into the executive branch. I mean, your thoughts on why Congress doesn't want to have this power, and then we're going to get into the politicization issue. But talk about that and how the REINS Act sort of forces this upon them.
It's a much safer approach if you're a politician to hand off responsibility for heavy decision making to agencies and rely on the experts there to make the hard calls. All you have to do as a politician is create an agency that's responsible for, say, safety writ large, right? And maybe in some topic area or financial stability or whatever the topic area is, and then hand it off to the bureaucrats. And then if they do a great job, you take credit. If they do a poor job, you call them on the carpet and have some sort of hearing, but it's just a circus act, right?
Right.
It's just kabuki theater.
Kabuki theater. Yeah.
Exactly. And so that's a really good political strategy, though, because very few people dig into the details of, okay, what was in that statute that was authorizing the creation of that agency? Were you too vague in your implementation of that creation of that agency, et cetera, et cetera? Instead, people look at the high level details. Is this guy for safety? Is this guy for environmental protection? And vote along those lines. So it's a good political strategy. Reins takes a little bit of that away because now you have to vote up or down on all the regulations that are coming out of those agencies. Whether they actually push back on some regulations is another question you might want to dig into. There's 8 different states that have REINS Acts on the
Right.
book, REINS style acts, and how much is being used is an open question. But I think this does change the behavior to some degree in Congress. There is some sort of record on the books now about different regulations, at least the major ones. And it changes the behavior of agencies too. They're going to think twice about what they're creating.
And we've certainly seen in places like Idaho and elsewhere that have enacted sweeping regulatory reforms that there hasn't been this compromise on public health, safety, or welfare that some folks had been predicting and moaning and wailing and gnashing their teeth. So let's talk about an ancillary part of this as well, which is a conversation I had with Ilya Shapiro and Jonathan Adler from now at William & Mary Law School. Which is the issue of the depoliticization of the courts here, right? Courts have become political animals, especially when they weigh in on these heady regulatory issues. If Congress takes a greater role in determining what's right, what's wrong, et cetera, in terms of these interpretation, it takes it out of the courts. Talk about that aspect of it.
I think we just have to acknowledge that politicization is going to happen
Sure.
everywhere, right? And this is true at the court level, but it's also true in regulatory agencies. And
Right.
let me just give a quick example here.
Please.
There's a regulation out of the Federal Railroad Administration that was first created in the Obama years. It was taken away in the first Trump administration, put back in place in the Biden years. And this is mandating a minimum crew size for freight trains.
Hold on. I'm chuckling because literally I posted about this yesterday, and you talk about the politicization, and I immediately got some union activist from out in California
Bingo.
saying that I'd never walked a line, therefore I shouldn't be talking about this. Go ahead and say this. Talk about this.
Well, so the
Explain the
veneer
issue
on this
too.
rule,
Yeah.
the veneer here is that it's a safety regulation. The FRA claimed when it first made the rule that it was needing minimum crew size mandates because it would make trains safer. But the statistics, I dug into this deep, don't bear this out. There are
Right.
some one-person crew operations out there. If you compare the safety records of those to the two or more crew size rules, in fact, that analysis shows that there's not a difference, despite what the FRA was saying. And the
Right.
FRA's own statistics bore this out. Yet they made the rule anyway. So what's driving it? It's politics.
Right.
So the simple point here is politics is everywhere. Congress, therefore, should have a layer of I guess, holding accountable the other branches.
It's interesting because it goes along with something that Jonathan Adler said, which is this idea of if it's going to get political on these things, then let's actually engage the politics in the process and have somebody have an up or down vote to see if these things are in fact popular in the sense of what popular democracy is supposed to reflect. That's essentially what you're echoing, isn't it?
That's precisely what I'm echoing.
Yeah.
And to bring it back to how we open this up, I want to make this point here because
Please.
it's subtle. The effect of all these regulations that are being made, I refer to the volume of regulations relative to the volume of legislation, is much bigger than we think when it's added up together, the
Right.
cumulative impact. I did a study a few years ago where I showed that the economy could have been 25% larger by the year 2012 if we hadn't had regulations
Right.
growing at the pace that they did. That's a $4 trillion impact in 2012 dollars.
Right. It's
So,
it's actually funny you say that because literally that's what I've been talking about with regards to regulatory cost and doing the forward projection from 2025 onward, that, if we just keep regulatory costs constant over time, we have a savings in the economy of $4 trillion. Go ahead, Patrick.
well, and you could also tie that back to your point about budgets you made earlier, right? If we have the flip side of that is if we don't have regulations growing, we have faster GDP growth.
Right.
And then we can talk about the mechanisms, but it's mostly if there aren't more and more regulations, business are able to invest in more profitable activities, better growth, better productivity growth, and in the long run, that leads to better GDP growth.
Right.
Therefore, a bigger tax base. And now you can bring that back to the budget conversation if you wanted to. But the point here is, REINS Act is vital for holding back this growth of regulatory costs. It doesn't mean, as you said earlier, that we're less necessarily losing something we value like safety or the environmental protection. We've seen this in British Columbia and Idaho and the state of Virginia that have successfully deregulated without losing those protections. But it does mean that we're avoiding some of these unnecessary costs, short run costs like paperwork, but long run costs like slower productivity growth and slower GDP growth that we really need to be paying more attention to.
Amen to that. The issue of opportunity cost and long-term impacts of that, this is hugely, hugely important. Patrick, how do folks find out more about the good work you are doing at the Hoover Institution?
Well, you can find my research page linked from my profile at the Hoover Institution, but I've also got a blog on Substack. It's called Third Order. So if you go look for Third Order on Substack, you'll find a lot of my writings there.
I appreciate it. Patrick McLaughlin, the research fellow with the Hoover Institution. Thank you so very much for joining us today.
It's been my pleasure. Thank you.
This has been yet another episode of our special series on the REINS Act in Focus from the Federal Newswire's Lunch Hour podcast. I'm your host, Andrew Langer. Enjoy the rest of your lunch.